Hi, it's Penny here, and today we're going to be talking about the most disappointing books that I read in 2024. Now, this isn't exactly the worst books that I read in 2024 because I did a really great job in 2024 of DNFing any 1 or 2 star books, like not all of them, but a lot of them. And I will do another video in a couple of days about all my DNFs, so the books that I didn't finish. And there were also a lot of books that weren't necessarily that great, but I picked them up knowing that they possibly weren't to my taste, and I still think that those books could be to someone else's taste. Do I think that these most disappointing books to me could be to someone else's taste? I guess so. In fact, I know some people love these, so I mean definitely other people could like these. And I was really hoping to like all of them, and some of them I gave 3 stars. They were still fine, but they just didn't meet my hopes and dreams. I do want to start with a couple of graphic novels before I get into my top 5 most disappointing reads. A couple of graphic novels that were also very disappointing. Firstly, we have Phoenix Endsong. Now admittedly, I don't think that these kind of comics are the kind of graphic novels I like, and when I picked it up, I knew that. I only picked it up for a readathon prompt and because I knew it would be a quick read, but honestly, I didn't think it would be as bad as it was. The art was awful, and this is an X-Men comic, right? So like part of a very popular franchise. You would expect the art to be somewhat decent, wouldn't you? Especially when the cover is beautiful. And also, I kind of just thought the plot would be better, like less angsty drama than it was. But no, the art was awful. It was just angsty drama. And also, like, I knew that going into this, I hadn't read any of the other comics, but I thought I knew enough of the story to be able to kind of follow it. And I could follow it, but it was less clear than I expected. And I don't think that's me. I think that's the storytelling style. So I don't know. I guess people who like X-Men comics and comics of this style might like this. Do you? I don't know. I hated it. Then as well, I picked up Remina by Junji Ito. Now, I have loved some things by Junji Ito before. In fact, Uzumaki is over here on my favorites shelf. I love Uzumaki, and I have several other Junji Ito short story collections on my shelves that I've really loved. Like, there have been lots of things by Junji Ito that I have loved. He writes like really dark and twisted horror manga. So I picked up Remina, expecting to really love it. I knew that it was a story about this man who discovers this planet and names it after his daughter, and then what happens is this planet turns out to be like one that travels around and eats other planets, and then everyone kind of draws these parallels between the planet and the daughter, and everything escalates in a way that I felt was very reminiscent of Tomie by Junji Ito, to the point where I was like, this isn't really an original idea. And I was very disappointed that he wasn't really doing much with the idea of the planet. Right at the end it kind of did, and it almost redeemed itself, but not really. And just honestly, I had no fun reading it. It was kind of just awful, as well as being like boring. And I think in the future, when I think about Junji Ito, I'm just going to try and forget Remina and pretend it doesn't exist. Okay, then let's get into the actual novels. Firstly, we have House of Flame and Shadows by Sarah J. Maas. Now, if you know my reading taste, you're probably thinking, Penny, why would you have thought you would even like this? And maybe that's a valid question. But also, House of Earth and Blood, I love this. I wasn't expecting to love it. Like, I've read Sarah J. Maas stuff before. I've read some of the Akatar books. Maybe just the first one and half of the second one. But I've also read the whole Throne of Glass series, and I quite liked that, although my enjoyment went downhill as the series went along. However, this one I thought was really on a different level from everything else I'd read by Sarah J. Maas. I loved her world building and her characters. So in this one, we're following this woman named Bryce, who's like this party girl, and then she witnesses a murder, and no one's really taking her serious because of the kind of disaster party girl she is. But she does kind of end up working together with this angel guy to try and solve this murder mystery. And honestly, it was great. Bryce as a character, great. The romance, I really enjoyed it. I don't often like romance, but I actually enjoyed this one. And as I said, like the urban fantasy world here, it's like a world with elves and shapeshifters and vampires and all of that, but with kind of like a modern setting. And I really like this first book. So then the second book came out. What was it called? House of Sky and Breath. And it was a disaster. Awful, awful, awful. And this one, like, she started following multiple perspectives, and as she always does, every character has to be paired up with another character. I could have forgiven that, but it was just a lot of like rambly blah blah blah, nothing really happening. And Bryce herself was like nowhere near as badass as she was in the first book. So I hated the second book. However, I still had hope. I was like, it's the second book in a trilogy. I think it's kind of a trilogy. She'll probably write more things in the world, and I probably won't pick them up. So I thought that second book could just be second book syndrome. I was hopeful that book 3 was going to bring it back together, especially because that cover is beautiful. I really wanted it to be good. And like, this is where we were going to get more of a focus, I thought, on some of the darker characters in this world, because like, this world has all these different houses, like each different kind of creature is aligned with a certain house, and House of Flame and Shadow is like the vampires and the demons and all those kind of ones. So, you know, I like dark things. I was hopeful that House of Flame and Shadow would bring it all together, and I do think House of Flame and Shadow is better than House of Sky and Breath. I actually in the end gave House of Flame and Shadow a 3 stars. Like, I don't think it was necessarily bad if that's the kind of book you want to read. Well, I mean, there's a lot of like blah blah blah, and like a lot of Bryce discovering things by just people telling it to her for no good reason, and a lot of her doing things just so she could be in a certain place, even though it made no sense for her to necessarily be doing those things. And as well, it kind of had links into Sarah J Maas's other works, and I was not interested in that at all. So just a big disappointment. And I think going forward, I'm just going to pretend House of Earth and Blood was a standalone. I ranted about that for way too long, so I don't know what's happening with this video and how long it's going to be. Let's try and be less ranty going forward. So the next book is one that is super popular. So many people were raving about this. I thought it's going to be really great. And that is The Sword of Kargan by M.L. Wang. And when I first started reading it, I was like, yep, this is great. We're following mainly 2 characters, this mother and her son. They live in kind of like this isolated village that has this big history of being like sword fighting warriors, like samurai type battle type things, and they see themselves as like the defense of the empire, because any of these other kingdoms have to come through them to attack the empire. However, there is kind of more to the history of the kingdom than a lot of them are aware of, and her son ends up being kind of exposed to some of what's going on in the rest of the world, which the mother actually knows quite a bit about, because she did live out in the rest of the world for a time and has kind of put that part of her life behind her. And then now that her son is asking questions, she has to decide how she's going to deal with that. And I loved the world that was created, and like a lot of the political questions that were being asked in the beginning, and like this difficult situation that the mother was in, trying to work out, like, does she align with her husband, or does she let her son know more about what's going on in the world? Like, such a great setup, such a great start. And then halfway through, maybe even slightly earlier, there's this big battle scene that kind of acts as a catalyst to head the plot off in a completely different direction. And we never came back to all the cool political stuff that I was interested in. Like, there's a few scenes related to the political part of the world, but it just doesn't really get into what I thought it was going to. Like, the son doesn't really get to learn about what's going on in the rest of the world, and I didn't feel like there were going to be any massive changes to the way things worked. Maybe. I don't know. I kind of skimmed a lot of the ending of it, and maybe this was because I skimmed it. I don't know. But for me, the ending of the book felt much less cohesive than the first half of the book. It was like the author had daydreamed or fantasized a bunch of these scenes in their head and just wanted to write out those fantasies without it necessarily like connecting together properly. Once again, characters were just like dumping info for no reason, like telling other characters information that the author clearly wanted us to have, even though it made no sense, especially in the context of what was happening, for those characters to be asking those questions or explaining the things they're explaining to the people they're explaining them to. Like, really didn't like the ending. So I gave it 3 stars, but that's mainly on the strength of the beginning. But I don't think it delivered on that. And I know that's a super unpopular opinion, but that's my opinion. Then next on the list we have The Binding by Bridget Collins. So I picked this up having previously loved The Betrayals by Bridget Collins. And once again, in the beginning, it was giving me everything that I wanted. We're following this young boy who is having problems where he doesn't remember things. I feel like I'm not remembering the plot properly either. But for whatever reason, he goes off to apprentice at this bookbinder. So the binders in this world are people who basically take people's memories and put them in a book so that they no longer have to remember those things. And so we're getting his experience as an apprentice binder, but also we're getting kind of his memories, and it's quite clear from early on that he's had some memories taken away from him. And so, you know, we're kind of getting his backstory and wondering what led to him having some of his memories bound. And the first half of the book, 5 stars. I loved it. The way that the mystery was set up was so amazing and like had me so invested, and it was written in such an emotional way. I was so connected to this main character. And then I'm trying to decide if it's spoilers to say what happened halfway through. I guess I can say the author made a brave choice of changing to a different perspective halfway through the book. That's not the only reason why the second half didn't work for me though. Like, I think I could have loved that perspective change if it hadn't. I just really didn't agree with a lot of the things that were happening, and I felt like some of the messages the author was trying to like put across weren't great, and it was just like a very kind of toxic, unsatisfying romance in some ways. I just honestly love the first half. Kind of want to get a different ending from somewhere. Like, is there another like alternate reality where I could find a different ending for that book? Because it could have been 5 stars and it ruined it. Then we have another book where maybe I shouldn't have been disappointed, maybe I should have expected it. And that is The Lost Metal by Brandon Sanderson. So this is the 4th and final book in Mistborn Era 2. So the original Mistborn series, it's right behind me, was amazing. Everybody loves it. But that's kind of like a more classical fantasy set in like semi-medieval times. Then Mistborn Era 2 kind of moves forward in time. It's still the same world with the same magic, which is like this metal-based magic where people will consume metals, and then depending on the type of metal, they will gain different powers. Then in Mistborn Era 2, we've like moved way forward in time, and now it's more of a Western style setting, which going into the series I knew was going to be a risk. I didn't necessarily know if the Western setting was going to be for me. And you know, I don't necessarily think it was that bad. I think that setting had a lot of potential to like do some cool things with the magic, which admittedly Brandon did do. However, there's a particular style of humor that these books have that I think just got worse and worse through the series, and that kind of humor just didn't work for me. It's a lot of like fat jokes and jokes about burning down buildings and just stupid shit that I don't care about. And maybe in the first book it was kind of okay because that humor was balanced out with a really good plot. And I had heard, even though I didn't mind the first book and then I liked the second and third ones less and less, I had heard the 4th book was where things really linked into the bigger Cosmere, and a lot of people who hadn't liked those first 3 books still really liked the last book. So I had hope that I would like the last book. And I did not. I hated it. I just felt like there were pages and pages of nonsense that didn't matter. And so much of the time I was just really angry with this book for wasting my time. And I pushed through. I read it purely because I knew it was going to have those bigger Cosmere connections. And it does. But honestly, I think to the detriment of that book. Like, I thought I would like seeing all those Cosmere connections because I had just kind of got to the end of like a big 2-year reread of the whole Cosmere. But I hated it. It was stupid. Possibly the stupidest book I read in the whole of 2024. In my opinion, because once again, this is a very unpopular opinion, the average rating for this book is like 4.58 or something ridiculous like that. I honestly don't understand. I'm really happy that a lot of people seem to like this book, but I hate it. Yeah, I really hate it. Then lastly, for the actual most disappointing book of the year is a book that I kind of hope I won't have to talk about again because I don't like talking about it, and that is The First Binding by R.R. Verdi. So going into this, I'd heard it was really great, but also that it was very reminiscent of Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss, which I really like Name of the Wind. And what people were also saying is that you're much more likely to get an ending to this new series than you are to the Kingkiller Chronicles. So I was like, cool, let's read it. It sounded really cool. And I'd read the first chapter. Again, the writing seemed really beautiful and the magic was really interesting, like very similar to the magic in The Name of the Wind, but not exactly. And the main character was a storyteller in a way that seemed very reminiscent of The Name of the Wind, but again, not exactly. So still, I went into it thinking it could be good. But the problem is that it was just almost beat for beat, same plot as Name of the Wind. And like, it's fine, you want to take that as inspiration, that's okay. And like, there were actually some things that were different. A lot of the mythology in The First Binding is inspired by East Asian culture, and I think that could have been so cool. But firstly, this book was incredibly slow. Like, Patrick Rothfuss also writes, I guess, fairly slow books, but the writing is quite delicious and like lovely to consume. And I don't think R.R. Verdi quite pulled that off in terms of copying The Name of the Wind, which is what I'm saying he's doing, because they got to a point, like, the plot was the same, and they got to a point where something happened and I was like, that is way too much the same. And at that point I said to myself, if the next plot from The Name of the Wind, if the next plot point from The Name of the Wind happens in The First Binding, then I have to give The First Binding 1 star because it's just copied the plot. Like, sure, the characters are a little bit different, but the magic in the world, I mean, the world is a little bit different because of that East Asian inspiration, but like, it's still very similar. Very similar. And the magic's very similar, and the plot is very similar, and the characters are very similar. And then the end of the book, very similar. Like, it just ripped it off. It's plagiarism. I hate it. I have seen people who haven't read the Kingkiller Chronicles reading this and really loving it, and I guess that's good for them. And I have also seen some people who have read The Name of the Wind reading this and loving it, and I think maybe they've just forgotten the plot of The Name of the Wind, because I don't know how you could read something and see how similar it is and think that that's okay. Although, I'm thinking that maybe people who read a lot of really formulaic fantasy are used to a lot of their fantasy plots seeming very similar, and so then maybe that's why they think it's okay. I don't get it. I just read it and slowly became more and more appalled about how much of a blatant ripoff it was. And then also, this was like a 40-hour audiobook, so I wasted, well, not 40 hours because I listened to it at 2 times speed, but I wasted 20 hours of my life on a complete ripoff. Oh, the worst. So disappointing. Anyway, those books were really disappointing, but I promise I did really love a lot of other books. And I have already posted some of my favorite videos, so if you want some more positivity, head over there. If you want some more negativity, in a couple of days I'll have my DNF video up and talk about some books that I disliked so much I didn't even bother finishing them. Anyway, if you have read any of the books that I talked about in this video, I would love to talk with you about them down in the comments, even if your opinions are different. I mean, if you liked any of these, please tell me why. You're most certainly not going to change my opinion, but from a pure curiosity perspective, I would be interested. Do subscribe if you'd like to see more of my bookish videos. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. I hope that you are doing well, and I will see you next time.